Is the Ukrainian economy growing faster than the Russian economy? Just how does a literal war-torn country under occupation have a more thriving economy than the Russian Federation, a G8 economy? Well, the answer actually won't be that surprising, but we're going to talk about what this means for Putin, his war effort, and his attempt to stay in power. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. But of course, guys, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. And also, if you want access to uncensored combat footage, the kind that YouTube would never, ever let me show you, that is for members only on combatvetnews.com. It's my version of Patreon, my version of Substack. The link is in the description. And thanks to all the members that do help us out. Okay, let's talk about Ukraine. The latest numbers is that actually Ukraine's real GDP has grown 1.7% in Q2 2025. Now, what I want to point out is that Ukrainian GDP is very, very seasonal because they have a heavy agricultural industry. And that means that, of course, you don't sell or export anything when the crops are planted, when they're growing, but then they're harvested and exported. And once they're exported, that's when you get paid. So using this kind of forecasting growth, especially on a quarter by quarter basis, is kind of goofy, right? But when you look deep in this article, you see that the IER and the German government is estimating their forecast for Ukrainian growth at 2.0%. The National Bank of Ukraine has actually lowered it to just 2.1%. And I think this is a significant, just the fact that you're maintaining growth, that the economy hasn't gone into recession is actually pretty impressive, given that, again, in July, Ukrainian GDP appeared to contract based simply on the scale of Russian drone strikes against Ukraine's economy, right? Russian drone strikes, of course, being up 152%. And so the takeaway, at least to me, is not so much that this is a great growth rate. This is a great growth rate for a country in a state of total war, to be clear, ramping up any level of growth. But again, for a developing economy, it's not spectacular. But again, what we compare this to is a country like Russia, right? Now, observe the Russian economy, which is growing at an annualized rate of 1.1%. And this is absolutely unbelievably poor for Russia. And let's see if we can get you the actual expected growth rate. Here we go. After Russia grew by 4.3% in 2024, the Russian central bank itself says only 1 to 2% growth this year, while the economic ministry of Russia, quote, may revise its 2.5% forecast. But remember, Vladimir Putin has explicitly said the Russian economy will not be allowed to fall into recession. So on one hand, Putin could, for example, withdraw from Ukraine and end the war, lift sanctions, and put his economy back on a stable footing. Or he could just instruct his banks and government to lie about their statistics. And this is something that Russian bankers and businessmen have explicitly told Western outlets, that they've been instructed to either lie or fudge numbers to prevent the economy from slipping into recession. And it's fairly obvious why this is happening, right? Again, we can see that even places like Rostat are sort of stuck having to increasingly fudge the numbers where, again, this is the Russian State Statistics Agency, the equivalent to the American Bureau of Labor Statistics, saying that, again, Russian growth is actually getting revised ever downward. But Putin, of course, is dismissing claims that this Ukraine war is devastating Russia's economy. But he says, listen, we have low debt and a diverse economy. Well, that's not really the case because, again, the war economy, Putin's war economy, is crowding out. It's so big. It's literally for every $100 spent in the Russian economy anywhere, 6 of that is spent directly on defense spending, right? And remember that for every defense dollar that is spent actually making a drone, there's a bunch of secondary spending that occurs kind of around that. For example, a Russian man who works in a drone factory will get paid, but then he'll go to the local liquor store and buy vodka with that. And so that vodka purchase is not directly defense spending, but at the end of the day, that dollar went straight from the Russian Defense Ministry right over to the liquor store. So even more of the Russian economy, right? You could probably say that I would estimate that realistically, probably about a quarter to half of all Russian economic activity is just supporting the war effort, which is a problem because, again, that guy making Shahed drones, those drones aren't actually economically productive. They're not allowing a different business to thrive. They're not making Russia more economically effective. Those Shahed drones aren't even sold overseas for money that comes back into the Russian economy. Instead, those are sent to Ukraine and blown up. So they are literally the physical manifestation of economically unproductive activity. It's like if someone could somehow work in a neat factory, like that's what you would effectively have created, an economy that is entirely neat. It's like it's like having a huge portion of your economy be World of Warcraft transactions. Okay, it's not economically productive. It's an economic sink, and so. Right there, the fact that Putin has to claim his economy is highly diverse and is like, wow, we have low debt. Guys, you have low debt because no one will lend you money. Russian sovereign debt is unbelievably expensive because it's been sanctioned. There's almost no buyers of it. And so this is a bad sign for Russia. And we can see that it's having a real social effect on the country. You can see the crime rate within Russia is hitting a 12-year high. This is a massive problem for Vladimir Putin, who, again, as a strong man, maintains popular support because he's able to ensure the country's safety and security. And the more that the signs that Russia is a safe, secure place to live diminish, the less popular Putin is going to become. Now, it won't show up in polling data because it is literally illegal to say, I don't like Vladimir Putin. But that doesn't mean that people in their hearts aren't going to get sick of it, particularly Russian oligarchs, right? The Russian Prosecutor General's office has said that they recorded about 30,000 crimes in the first half of 2025, a rise of about 10% from the same period last year, and the highest figure since 2013. Now, the agency doesn't disclose the type of crimes, but again, some people argue it's a bunch of veterans that have no real social support being flooded back into the country, including a lot of veterans who serve in the war and then, remember, were recruited from prisons with the promise that if they survived a certain length of time, they would have their crimes forgiven. And so there's some of that, but also remember, just poverty. Poverty itself facilitates criminal activity. And you also, of course, have the increasing criminalization of non-criminal activities, like criticizing the Russia's war in Ukraine. That itself is a crime. So you're seeing both a sign of increased militarization and likely decreased economic security among Russians. And we can see why. Again, China is trying to soak up more of the Russian oil sales that is being offset by India, right? India, of course, trying to sort of thread the needle by remaining close to Russia, but also not enable their rival China. And this is sort of an Indian problem, is that India and China are regional rivals. China has very explicitly put its hat into the ring behind Russia. And so India is asking itself increasingly, well, if I buy Russian oil, is that enough to buy me loyalty from the Russian state more so than China? And India has to say, listen, I think I'd rather be friends with the West, even though the West is not been the reliable ally we're used to. So Chinese refiners seem to be trying to scale up their support, but just to offset the loss in Indian oil purchases, which is, again, bad for Russia. India was the second largest buyer of oil from the Russian Federation, buyer of sanctioned oil. And it's a pretty big problem. But the problem goes even deeper than that because, well, as we talked about, Russian drone strikes really damaged the Ukrainian economy. The Ukrainians have said, listen, I think we're going to find the silver lining in this cloud of drones hitting our country, which is to say, man, this is actually an effective tool of economic warfare. And so they've been investing heavily in their own long-range drones. And in fact, the Ukrainians have recently unveiled something that had previously been a secret weapon, a Ukrainian cruise missile with claims to have a nearly 2,000-mile range and a 100-kilogram warhead. And so the range is less exceptional. I mean, that's a good range, don't get me wrong. But it would allow them to hit lots of other parts of the Russian economy, which is exceptionally brittle, because essentially you have the war economy, which are legitimate military targets, and Ukraine routinely targets like drone factories. But then you also have the oil economy, which is really the only economically productive industry that still exists. Almost every other Russian industry has faced almost total collapse, has basically been surviving on bank loans and massive debt. So the Ukrainian cruise missile, which they're calling the Flamingo, but is unusually appears to be a clone of, let's see if I can find it here, a company called HUMILIATED. They made something called an FP5, which has a nearly identical range, an identical launch platform, identical structure. But what I think is most interesting is, again, this would enable the Ukrainians to strike strategic Russian targets with relative affordability, right? Basically, anywhere, I mean, this circle that we see here from Kiev all the way into Kazakhstan, this represents basically all of the Russian economy, right? There's really no economic activity happening in places like Siberia. In fact, Siberia is so inhospitable to human life that one of the reasons Russian information operations include climate change denial is actually because in a world beset by climate change, they expect millions of people to die and there'll be entire countries turned into refugee states. But for Putin, Siberia will become a farmland paradise, and Russia will suddenly control instead of controlling a barren wasteland, it'll control some of the most fertile farmland on on planet Earth. So again, you got to be pretty desperate to be like, we could make Russia's geopolitical situation slightly improved. All we have to do is cook entire countries. But I think what's the takeaway here is that basically this cruise missile will be able to hit essentially any target in the Russian economy. So things aren't going to be getting better for Russia. In all likelihood, they are going to get significantly, significantly worse. Anyway, that's all I had, guys. Thanks to the Colonel tier members like Peter Fucci, Dan M, Petro, Henry Russo, Ira Sky, Call Chris Rossi, all of our Lieutenant tier members over on Combat Vet News. Couldn't do it without you guys. See you in the next one. Hit that subscribe button. Cheers.